Good evening, good evening, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to TTIS, where we build confident, empowered educators through empathy and strategy, giving you practical tools that you can use today. And if you're new to our channel, my name is Tamara Gibson. I'm an educator, a trainer, and a coach, and I've worked in Title I campuses for over 25 years. Now, I have the pleasure of supporting new special education teachers and classroom teachers to help you make informed instructional decisions. And tonight, we're discussing the least restricted environment. This conversation comes up quite a bit within ARDS. It also comes in with the special education exam that many of you are preparing for. And for those of you who have students that have landed in your classroom that you are servicing that are in need of your support, as a general education teacher, this information will be of assistance to you. And you've probably heard this sentence in the hallway, maybe of a staff meeting or even an ARD meeting. Just put the students in general education more. That's the least restricted environment. And if you've ever nodded your head along with that logic, I want you to hear me real clear tonight as we go through our discussion, because that's not what the least restrictive environment really means. Not legally, not on your exam, and not for the students that are sitting in front of you. One of the common mistakes when addressing this subject is the thought that the least restrictive environment is just a place. I've even referred to it in many of my conversations in that manner. But tonight, I want to rephrase it properly because it is a decision. And I'm going to share some best practices on how to make that decision the way the law requires, the way the SPED 186 exam is going to test it, and the way that your ARD committee should be making it as a group every single time. And when we're done tonight, you'll be able to look at your students' placement and explain why the specific setting is the right one and not just the most popular one or a rollover that's happening from year to year. And so what else are we going to cover in our session? My first one, which I just like the title, So What, Ms. Gibson? That I say placement instead of decision. Well, I want to talk to you about why that really matters. Then the continuum is a ladder, not a menu, a selection on a board. And then maximize extent appropriate, how it's doing all of the work really. And I'll go deeper into each one of these topics. And the last that I'll cover, and I think one of the ones that a lot of times is skipped over, is the supplementary aids and services. And not skipped over in the fact that they're not administered, but skipped over in the fact that sometimes the choice is not always deeply involved. And I'll explain a little bit more as we go on over our discussion this evening. So let's jump into the first thing. Why is placement instead of decision making matter? Well, LRE gets taught early in most certification programs, and it gets taught really fast. So you learn that there's a continuum, and you learn the phrase maximum extent appropriate, and often they move on. But LRE is not just a vocabulary term. It's a legal requirement under IDEA that shapes almost every placement decision that a special education teacher touches. And it's also one of the descriptors on our exam study guide that is tested in a very specific way. And that is competency number 1. So here we have competency number 1. And it doesn't just ask you whether you know LRE exists. And description H, which you have on your screen, It asks whether you can audit a student's actual class schedule. And then it's going to ask you to determine whether it complies with the LRE requirement. And I have to know the requirement. And then the schedule of services written into the student's IEP. That, my friends, is not recall. That's application. And here's the real world weight behind it. If I get LRE wrong in my classroom, one of two things are going to happen. Either a student gets pulled into a more restrictive setting than they need because it's easier for the scheduler, or it's easier for the staff, or it's easier for everyone, well, except the student. Or two, a student gets left in general education settings without the support. The IEP really calls for us to make a good decision for them. Because someone assumed inclusion alone equals compliance is not acceptable. Both of those are due process compliance waiting to happen. And although violations regarding faith sits at the top of the list of those that are often prosecuted, both of them can show up in state complaint violations and investigations. So this is not an abstract legal concept. It's something that you and I must understand to make decisions about that could possibly be very early in your career. Even if you haven't had an ARD right now, it could be one that's waiting to happen in the next day or so. So before we go any further, I want to address something that has been in the news because of some of your questions that you might have. And I'd rather always to give you facts than to, I guess, allow it to linger where there's no clarity. In June of this year, the United States Department of Education announced an interagency agreement shifting day-to-day administration of special education programs, including the offices that oversee IDEA, to the Department of Health and Human Services. And here's what that means and what it doesn't mean. It does not change IDEA itself. It doesn't change FAPE or LRE, nor does it change a family's due process rights. Those are statutes and regulations, not administrative assignments, and they remain in effect exactly as written. What it does change is which federal agency handles the administrative functions tied to IDEA at the federal level. For you and your classroom, your compliance obligations, your IEP timelines, your LRE requirements, none of that shifts. But for the purpose of tonight and my channel, I'm choosing to keep my personal feelings out of this and just tell you the facts. I'll keep how I feel about the reorganization of it to myself. But I'm telling you that this so that if a parent or a colleague brings it up, you can speak to it accurately instead of from these fanatical headlines or the headlines that make it seem like nothing even occurred, that it was an everyday thing. But LRE is a legally required decision-making process. It's not a preference, and it's tested on the exam as an applied skill, not as a definition. And I want to make sure that you're prepared for that distinction. For my people who have already subscribed to the channel, I want to take this moment to thank you. We are getting closer to our goal of 500 subscribers. So if you have not hit the subscribe button, going from subscribe to subscribe, I'd love for you to do that now. And as we continue on with our message about LRE, I'm jumping now to the continuum as a ladder, which is exactly what we started with, and not a menu, and why I've said that. So most explanations of LRE stand in the wrong place. So I want to build a foundation the right way. Typically, they start with a continuum of placements, which is very important, but often they skip the actual legal standards that govern how you can use that continuum. So here's the standard word for word on your screen, the exact language that draws in from IDEA, section 1412, F, letter A. And it reads as, under the least restricted environment, here's the general statement. To the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities, including children in public or private institutions or other care facilities, are educated with children who are not disabled, and a special classes, separate schools, or other removal of children with disabilities from the regular education environment occurs only when the nature or the severity of the disability of a child is such that education and regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. I want you to make sure you pause and read that again slowly, because there's two conditions in there, not just one. First, students are educated with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. Second, removal from that setting is only justified when regular classes with supplementary aids and services cannot satisfactorily meet the student's need. That second half is the part that almost everyone forgets or glosses over. And LRE isn't just about inclusion being the goal, it's about data that backs the removal required with justifications every single time. And you know that on this channel, I talk to you about data leading the decisions all the time. Now let's talk about the continuum itself, because you likely have seen this visual that I'm placing on our screen right now, or some version of it. If you've been into any of our trainings at TTIS, you've seen this TEA graphic during our training sessions, and you already know the shape of it. But I want you to picture a ladder with 7 rungs, and at the very top is general education with no supplementary aids or services. That's not even a special education placement. It's considered the baseline. Then the second special education settings begin. Or I'm sorry, then the special education settings, they begin. So right below that, you got general education with secondary aids and services, which is the least restricted special education setting on the continuum. Then the resource placements in a special education classroom, less than 40% of the day. Then self-contained placement, more than 40% of the day. Then separate school, residential placement, hospital or homebound placement at the very bottom being the most restrictive. And here's the part that I really want you to understand, that the ladder is not a ranking of good or bad. It's not saying rung 2 is always better than rung 4. It's saying these are the available options, and your job, the art committee's job, is to identify which rung matches that specific student's needs based on data, not based on which rung looks best on paper or feels most comfortable for the adults in the room. My point for this section of our discussion is that the continuum exists so that you have options, not so that you have a default. The starting assumption is always general education with support, and every step down the ladder requires evidence that the previous step wasn't sufficient. wasn't sufficient for the student's growth. So how does that intertwine or make sense with the maximum extent appropriate? Well, my opinion is doing all of the work. It's the hinge that the entire LRE requirement swings on, and it's also where I see the most confusion in new educators. Appropriate is not the same as most inclusive. I want to say that twice because it matters that much to me. Appropriate does not mean the same as most inclusive. A student who is placed in a general education classroom without supports they need isn't a less restrictive environment. It's an inappropriate one. LRE requires appropriateness first, and restrictiveness is measured with the appropriate range, and that is specialized to that student. That's why we call it an individualized educational plan or program. But let's do a quick classroom example. I want you to imagine a student with a significant intellectual disability whose IEP goal focuses heavily on functional life skills, community-based instruction, and vocational readiness. If that student spends the entire day in general education classroom working on grade level content that has nothing to do with their IEP goals, that's not compliance with LRE just because it looks inclusive. That student isn't accessing an appropriate education in that setting, and a stronger LRE analysis might actually call for more specialized instructional time, not less. The data shows the general education setting isn't where the goal can be met in that instance. Now I want to flip this so that you see it from the other lens. I want you to imagine a student with a specific learning disability and reading, receiving strong accommodations, making progress on every goal this year. And then their teacher pulls them into a resource room for reading instruction for an hour a day. If that hour of pull out isn't justified by current data, showing that the students need that level of intensity, that's the other direction with the same mistake. The team defaulted to more restrictive because it felt safer. Or maybe it was more manageable, but not because the data called for it. And so I go back to competency 1, descriptor H. It audits a student's schedule against their IEP, means asking for every block of that student's day. Does this match what the IEP really requires? And is there current data supporting this level of restrictiveness? Not last year's data, not an assumption carried over from a previous grade, but current data, which is the first step of our data need action framework. We talk about it as regards to the exam, and we discuss it even more when we're putting things in life situations, real scenarios that can happen in your classroom every day. So I want to ask you to pull up your schedule for one of your students on your caseload right now, or think of them if you can. And I want you to walk through each period and ask yourself honestly, can I point to the specific data that justifies this student being in this setting for this block of time? If you can answer that in under a few seconds for every student you serve, that's worth a pat on the back. But if you can't do that, I want you to take a closer look before their very next ARG comes up. So let's wrap up this section with noting that the maximum extent of appropriate means the least restrictive setting that is still appropriate for that individual student's needs. And the appropriateness is always determined by the data, not by default, not because last year that's what was done, Or what does the current data say? There is a step in the LRE analysis that I feel like gets rushed through. And tonight, I want to make sure that we run headfirst into it, and that is supplementary aids and services. This step sometimes is skipped over. Before an art committee can make a determination to move a student to a more restrictive setting, they have to prove it. The law requires that they consider whether the supplementary aids and services could make that setting less restrictive. Well, what kinds of things could that be? These supplemental aids and services could be preferential seating, assistive technology, maybe having a paraprofessional to support or behavioral supports put in place, even co-teaching and content mastery support. That's what it could look like. So if I'm in a classroom or I'm in an ARD and I'm observing the student in their classroom and I attend this ARD, and this ARD meeting committee decides that they're going to jump straight to a more restrictive environment without first documenting what supports they've already tried in the general education setting and how the student has responded, that's against the law. Why does this matter? Because truthfully, we want to avoid investigations. And the more that we do what we're supposed to do in the processes and procedures of special education, the more likely we will be in compliance and the student will thrive. If a due process complaint or a state complaint ever gets filed on a placement decision, one of the first things investigators look for is what I'm telling you, documentation. They also want to know what was considered and put in place for those supplementary aids and services. And where's the data that shows whether or not it was working? And if that documentation doesn't exist, the district's positioning is weak. And it doesn't matter if ultimately this was the right placement decision. It's the fact that the procedures are not being followed. And remember, education itself, and especially special education, is procedures being followed. It's a step-by-step so that everything is fair to the best of our ability. And what might this look like in a classroom setting? Well, say a general education teacher tells the art committee that the student is constantly off task. They're disruptive during independent work time, and they recommend moving the student to a self-contained setting. Before that conversation goes any further, the true question has to be, what supplementary aids and services have been tried? I know. I've been in situations where I've had to have students in my setting knowing that they were supposed to be somewhere else for weeks. But we had to find the data. And we had to try to see if certain things are going to work. Has the student had a visual schedule or a shortened assignment with built-in breaks? Have we tried preferential seating or check-in or check-out system? Well, if none of these things have been tried, the team isn't really ready to talk about a more restrictive placement. They have to talk about what to try first. Then collect the data on how the student responds to what they're trying. So I'm saying that supplementary aids and services aren't a box that we just simply check off. It's a required step in the reasoning process. And skipping this step is one of the fastest ways to end up out of compliance, even when the eventual placement decision might have been the correct one. And before we go into our scenario practices tonight, for those that are preparing for SPED 186 exam, I'd like to ask you to join our mailing list. For those who are already in the school buildings and you are looking for more support, this week we're spotlighting how to audit a real student schedule. I want to give you some quick steps to include in your resource bag. And we have been collecting resources all over the last few months in regards to the sessions that we host here on YouTube, and would love for you to go to our website and find out more about that. And for those who are preparing for SPED 186, it is time to do our practice so that you can stay in the game. So let's apply the thinking that we've been presenting tonight under some exam conditions. Question number 1, an audit committee is reviewing a student's placement. The student has a specific learning disability and currently receives all core instructions in a self-contained special education classroom. The student's most recent progress monitor shows that the student has met or exceeded expectation on every IEP goal for 2 consecutive reporting periods. Which of the following actions best reflects the requirements of the least restrictive environment? A, maintain the current placement since the student's progress shows the setting is working well. B, reconvene the ARD committee to review whether the student's current level of restriction is still appropriate given the demonstrated progress, and consider what supplementary aids and services would support increased access to general education. Or C, immediately transition the student to full-time general education without further ARD decisions since the goal has been met. Or D, increase the frequency of progress monitoring in the current setting before making any placement decision. Well, I hope that you chose B. Strong, consistent progress is exactly the kind of data points that should trigger an LRE review. Not a placement change made unilaterally, and not an assumption that the things should stay the same simply because they're working. What the exam is actually assessing here is whether you understand that LRE is reviewed continuously in light of new data, and that any placement change in either direction has to go through the ARD committee process. Now remember, I'm talking to you about a utopian world with everything in place. Take the value of what they give to you and leave your personal things aside. Follow what it states for the followers, because these distractors are tempting. A appears to the instinct of not fixing what isn't broken, but LRE requires ongoing appropriateness review, not comfort with the status quo. C appears to be enthusiastic about student progress, but good intentions doesn't replace the required process. And then D, well, it feels cautious and data-driven, which sounds right, but it's a way of delaying a decision the current data already supports making. Let's try another one together. And number 2. A general education teacher requests that a student be moved to a more restrictive setting due to behavioral concerns during independent work time. Before this request is brought to the ARD committee, which of the following should occur first? A, the team should document what supplementary aids and services have already been implemented in the general education setting and how the student responded. B, the special education teacher should immediately schedule an FBA to determine the function of the behavior. C, the student should be temporarily moved to a self-contained setting where the team gathers more information. D, the general education teacher should be given a behavior management training before any changes are considered. I hope you chose A. before any restrictive placement change can be justified under LRE. The law really requires that supplementary aids and services be considered and documented first. I spent quite a bit of time talking to you just a little while ago about this. I know that there are temptations within these other answer choices, but here the test is actually assessing whether you know that supplementary aids and services documentation is a required step in the LRE analysis before any conversation about a more restrictive placement begins. As we recap our conversation, I want to restate that allowing the current data, not history, not convenience, to determine whether a more restriction is generally necessary is a must. Start with the assumption of general education with support. Document what has been tried and revisit that decision consistently, continuously even. That's the difference between a teacher who treats LRE as a line on a form and a teacher who treats it as an ongoing responsibility. It's the kind of teacher that we here at TTIS is trying to help you to become. If this way of thinking, LRE as a continuous data-driven decision instead of a one-time placement, is different than how you were taught, I'd like to invite you, as you prepare for your SPED 186, to join our cohort. We offer this twice a month. We also have an online course that is being built for it as well, for those that cannot fit our Tuesday evening and our Saturday morning schedule. If you are also drowning in what to do next or how to fix things, you don't have to. We've built a way for you to join our first year accelerator coaching program, where we outline your needs, what needs to be done first, next, then, and last, and how to help you to have a great first year. You are carrying this responsibility all year of LRE and the compliance that comes along with special education. Whether they are students sitting in your classroom or you are becoming the special education specialist, you carry the weight and the load. So let's make sure that you can explain it with confidence in your classroom and choose the right choice on the answers when you take the exam. As always, I want to thank you for watching. I'm grateful that you arrived here at TT Innovates. I hope that you've already hit that subscribe button. And I have on our screen some other choices of curriculum that we also help with. PPR 160, 293, and EC 391 right now, it is online. We are here to support you. You know my goal. It is to help to teach, train, and provide you innovative solutions so that you are successful on the exam and in your classroom. Have a great evening, everyone, and I'll see you again next week, where we'll start an entire new series of September, preparing you for all of the paperwork and behavior concerns that you might have. Good night, everyone.